Alright, guys, so the sky is falling down and it's falling down on Europe because they aren't in a good place. From higher energy prices to funding an endless war, the economies of the EU they are in crisis mode. Not even China's massive stimulus can save them. And if we need further confirmation, we just need to look at the ECB. Europe's central bank is front running the Federal Reserve once again. The ECB has cut rates for the third time in a year to save the EU economy. Deposit rates have been lowered to 3.25% from 3.5. They believe inflation is under control, but it only sets up the EU for bigger shocks down the road. This is a move of desperation. Lowering rates before the Federal Reserve cuts is very risky. In just a week, the euro has crashed almost 1% against the dollar, which is a very big move. Imports to the EU, especially energy, are now going to be more expensive. Everything they import from oil to cars is going to rise in price, but the ECB had to cut. They have to risk higher domestic inflation because the entire EU economy is on the brink of collapse. It's very telling when we have the head of the ECB, Christine Lagarde, sounding the alarm bells. She's warning the world economy is facing a 1920s Great Depression risk. That modern central bankers have to manage structural change, the ECB has to use the tools to prevent a depression. And let me decipher all this mumbo jumbo. Lagarde is just trying to find an excuse to lower interest rates, which further reinforces what we've been saying for the longest time. We are heading towards a great melt-up in the markets. Europe is moving to re-zombify their economy once again. Before 2022, inflation in the EU has been largely under 2%. Now, for you and me, this sounds great. But for central bankers, this is a nightmare, it's a disaster to them. Modern monetary theory dictates inflation has to be 2% or higher to somehow spur economic growth. This is dangerous and desperate at the same time. Instead of solving the root causes of the EU economy, we are once again reverting to Japan style economics. The ECB is using financial engineering to solve an industrial and geopolitical problem. This is frightening because the ECB is going to push the world into an easing cycle when inflation risks are still present. According to Morgan Stanley, the central bank wants to avoid falling back to a world of below 2% inflation. And to do that, Lagarde will reduce interest rates by half, dropping it to just 1.75% next year. This is maybe quite reckless because the world is still on fire. The Russia-Ukraine war isn't done. The Middle East is still on fire. And any day now, the oil fields in Iran could get blown up. The EU cutting rates is very telling. It's important to quantify how big the EU economy is. In 2022, the EU's GDP stood at 15.9 trillion euros, and that's around 16% of global GDP, making it the third biggest economy in the world, just behind China. And in 2023, it's around 17%. So what Europe does is very important. Trying to lower interest rates to boost this number up isn't the solution. It's a knee-jerk reaction, it's just a partial fix. The key drivers of EU productivity has been dismantled. Europe needs to find a way to get back cheap energy. It could be making peace with the Russians. Barring that, they could always fire up the nuclear plants or import cheap solar panels from China. But they have to plug this hole because it's simply destroying their ability to compete globally. Mario Draghi, the former ECB president, released a report that tells us how far behind Europe is in the world. Take industrial retail power prices for example. In 2023, China and the US were paying around 80 euros per megawatt hour. Europe, on the other hand, is paying well over 170 euros. That is an incredible 150% difference between the two biggest economies in the world. Another major input, industrial gas, also costs more in the EU, over 300% versus the US. And that's why oil companies are shutting down plants in places like Germany. The inputs are just too expensive. The refineries can't survive. And this is the biggest hole Europe has to plug. LNG all the way from Qatar or the US is just too expensive. It's magnitudes more than cheap Russian gas. Until today, Europe is still subsidizing their industries. They are incurring a ton of debt to bring down energy costs for their manufacturers, and it's a ton of money. Until mid 2023, Europe spent over 650 billion euros to shield consumers and companies. And this is money they simply don't have. It is borrowed into existence. EU members had to spend between 1 to 7% of GDP just to subsidize higher energy bills. And this is making countries like France explode their deficit spending. Let's not forget, Macron has a deficit that's going to exceed 6% of GDP, and that's on par with the United States. But unlike the US, EU countries, they don't have the reserve currency. So the debt burden is just going to keep ballooning higher and higher. And that takes away money they can deploy to other parts of the economy. Subsidizing EVs, for example, that's a very big one. There's a reason why Germany cancelled those because they simply can't afford it. Germany is the biggest economy in the EU and they are facing the prospect of a horrible recession. As we speak, the country is likely in one now. This is comparing today's growth versus 12 months back, which was already extremely weak. That was a very low bar and somehow they managed to go under it. But the estimates going forward from today till 2026 are still horrible. We have growth of only 0.3% for the next 2 years. This is a classic case of economic stagnation. We cannot underestimate how important energy inputs are. It's why the US is all over the world pumping out tons of oil. It's why China is developing cheap solar panels and next generation nuclear power. The world is decoupling. The US is going full protectionist, which means the EU have to stand on their own 2 feet. Financial engineering is not going to save their industries. This chart is simply terrifying. Comparing the EU's manufacturing industries in 2024 to 3 years back, we can see a near total collapse. Everything from chemicals to metals and even plastics are in the contraction zone. In other words, production is down, market share has been lost, and revenue has shrunk. In countries like France, Italy, and Germany, a huge part of their economies, they all revolve around industrial output. The story, unfortunately, is just gonna get worse. This is where China gets involved. Over the past few weeks, Beijing has launched a massive stimulus package to revive consumer demand. Officials are doing a lot to stabilize the housing market and make people in China confident enough to go out and spend. The government is going to increase bank lending by 4 trillion RMB or nearly $600 billion. That's a lot of funds to support the housing market, but that is not money flowing to people. It isn't stimulus checks like what the US did back in 2020. You're not going to have a ton of Chinese consumers flushed with free cash. They're not going to run around and buy up luxury bags from LVMH or perfume from France. Europe will not benefit from this. We must understand what China is trying to accomplish with this capital injection into the banks. They are trying to solve their local government debt crisis. It's a time bomb Beijing is now trying to defuse. As it stands, China's local hidden debt is enormous. The IMF estimates it at around 50% of GDP, with 66 trillion yuan of outstanding bonds that pay interest. China's flooding the bank with liquidity and they're cutting interest rates to ensure the local debt doesn't explode. The stimulus package is more one of stabilization, is to put a floor under the property collapse first. And that's the main priority to build back confidence. It isn't to save the world economy. Now, going forward, even after the stabilization, Europe's economy still won't benefit. China's rebound won't save EU industries. In fact, the exact opposite might happen. And yes, it's all because of Western decoupling. Europe's trade war with China has triggered a realization. The Chinese, they have to assume that Europe is going to forever contain their economy and industries. And if that's the case, you need to shift demand back to the domestic consumer. You want to rely on your own population to plug the gap as exports to the West starts to drop. From 2022 to 2023, the EU exported around 20 billion euros worth of goods every single month, and that's over 200 billion in a year. However, EU imports from Beijing are starting to drop from 50 billion a month to under 40 billion. It's a big drop of around 20%. China sees this decoupling, they're not blind, and it's even before the EV tariffs arriving in November. So Europe's imports from China are going to drop even further. And this brings us to the effects of China's stimulus. If you're Beijing and you see Europe importing less, You have to take action. Any stimulus you give will be to help your local industries. So we can expect terms and conditions on the stimulus when it happens, if it happens. It's very likely the money, if it comes, will restrict Chinese consumers to buying local brands. And even without the conditions, local consumers will probably buy Chinese products anyway. It's simply cheaper and at the same time, superior quality. And this is some of BYD's current lineup. There's your standard SUV all the way to hypercars like the Wangyang New 9. But let's just focus on the BYD Seagull and the King. These are more affordable vehicles. Just look at the price disparity. For the Seagull, the EU has to buy the car at $21,000 while Chinese consumers can get it at only 10 grand. The BYD King retails for over 30 grand in Brazil. In China, it's less than 17,000. These are some of the most competitive cars in the world. Any imports coming in from Europe will cost much more and probably perform much less. So Europe has a big problem they need to confront. They are behind the 8 ball in EVs and their cost of manufacturing is just too high. As a result, Chinese consumers are beginning to shift. They are no longer shopping for luxury but shopping for value. Since 2019, German automakers including Volkswagen and Mercedes, they have lost market share in China from 25% down to 14%. And it highlights the issue of competitiveness. No matter the amount of financial magic, you can't really bridge this gap. Lagarde can slash interest rates down to 0%, but it still doesn't solve the core problem. Europe needs a source of cheap energy. Manufacturing costs have to come down. Obviously, the quickest way to stabilize their situation is to get back cheap Russian gas. And if Europe manages to do that, they can regain their industries over time. They will get cheap energy while China will be forced to pay more for Russian energy because there's now another buyer. Basic supply and demand. It's actually the only way Europe can regain their manufacturing and compete with the US again. The EU is paying a ton of money for gas today, even after the big drop. Their costs are easily 3 or 4 times higher than the US. But look at prices back in 2020 and before that. Thanks to Russian supply from Nord Stream, EU energy prices were on par with the US. You add in cheap inputs from China, and that allowed Europe to surpass US manufacturing. There are definitely other solutions like nuclear power and solar panels for sure, but those will take time. The fastest way to ensure industrial survival is, unfortunately or fortunately, to turn back on Russian gas. And if you think about it, it's really a strategic winning move. You pay less for energy and you'll force one of your biggest competitors, China, to pay more. It's more effective than cutting interest rates, but because of geopolitics, Europe can't bring themselves to do it. It would mean the unthinkable. It would mean admitting defeat to Russia. But let me know what you think. Can Europe's economy recover without cheap energy? And is there any other way out of this mess? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.